everybody, Frank Markow here. Welcome to part one of a two-part series on an overview and introduction to my book, Organizational Behavior in Christian Perspective. This video will set you up to understand the first part of the book, and in the second video we'll go through the last chapters on leadership and organizational culture. Now, you might be asking yourself, why another book on leadership? Man, don't we have enough of those things? I can't get through the airport without tripping over a stack of leadership books written by coaches and CEOs, and a lot of pastors write books and write podcasts. Why do we need this book? Well, my contention is that leadership fails when it ignores the organizational system. And so we have no shortage of books about leadership, but I think we still struggle organizationally because we don't understand that leadership doesn't occur in isolation, but it happens in the system. It happens within the organization itself. And so as a leader, your role is foundational. However, you are working within a larger system, which is comprised of people, history, problems, visions, missions, goals, all those sorts of things. And so you have to understand that you're leading a lot of complexity. And so it's really learning to see the invisible structure beneath the surface that leaders need to understand. And so I want to introduce you to a framework that I think is going to help you understand this entire book, as well as the subsequent part of the class here. So, what is organizational behavior? Well, organizational behavior is the study of people and organizations and how they relate to each other and to the organization as a whole. And the focus is on relationships, cultures, systems, and behaviors at work. Now, what is organizational behavior not? Well, it's not simply business pragmatism. You might think, well, is this a business book? No, it's not about accomplishing the bottom line, maximizing profit, and talking about strategy and those sorts of things. It's also not pop psychology. And we have a lot of interesting, fun reads out there in the pop psychology world too, don't we? And it's also not a leadership hack, right? It's like, okay, what are these 10 things that I need to know? What are the 3 things I need to know about leadership? It's none of those things. It really is based upon social science, upon theory, upon applied diagnosis, and it treats the organizations not just as a machine, but as a living system, as a culture, as power networks, as meaning-making environments. And so the study of organizational behavior helps us as pastors and leaders. It helps us to kind of understand that human side of organizations. What's going on with my people? Now, what makes OB in a church context different from any other context? Well, because the contemporary church faces a lot of challenges. First of all, we're not like any other organization, are we? We have been around for a couple thousand years now, and before that, we were rooted in, the Judeo tradition handed down by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, the kings, right? The intertestamental period. So, and then you get Jesus and the apostles and the development of the church. And then you get 2,000 years of history, right? So we are kind of rooted in that story. And there is no other organization on earth that has such an extensive history. And part of that becomes part of the blessing and the challenge of leading in a contemporary context. Also, churches have taken on a lot of different shapes and sizes, right? Most of you are probably part of a Pentecostal tradition, but there's a lot of different traditions out there. You've got the Catholic Church, you've got the Orthodox Church, you've got 100,000, well, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. You've got literally thousands of denominations. And even within Pentecostalism, right, we've got lots of streams of Pentecostalism. We've got Foursquare, our own beloved denomination, but then you've got Assemblies and Church of God in Christ. You've got Church of God Cleveland, right? So there's a lot of different expressions even within our own Pentecostal tradition. And so that makes it tricky. And so there's really no one size fits all because everybody has these different sort of traditions. And then, of course, we have a theological and spiritually rooted essence, right? So Jesus established his church. He said, I will build it and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am amongst them. And so we understand sort of from an ecclesiological perspective the nature of the church, right? And this is a wonderful thing. And again, as I mentioned in my intro video, this is really foundational to who we are as Christian leaders, is that theological essence and our deep roots with the historic church and within the Pentecostal tradition. But this can also make it sort of challenging, right? So we don't have a CEO, so to speak, that we can go to, right? Now, we do have the Holy Spirit, and we rely upon being Spirit-led and understanding that. And I believe the Spirit gives us resources, and God has given us a mind, and He's given us a whole body of knowledge that we can learn from. So as I mentioned in my intro, we're sort of now adding another lens, another perspective, and integrating it with our theological and historical understanding of how to lead in a Pentecostal church. So why does OB matter in a church? Well, lots of reasons. Because churches are comprised of people, and I think sometimes we think that it's an altogether otherworldly entity. And, in a sense it is. We've got that spiritual essence, as I just mentioned. But, your church is comprised of a bunch of people. And people have different backgrounds and personalities and issues and problems, right? When you see people show up to your church, and no matter how well-meaning or good they are, you should see them carrying a couple of, suitcases with them, right? Their baggage, so to speak. Now, it's not all bad baggage, but it's their experience, it's their expectations, it's their hopes, it's their assumptions, right? So people come, and we all have these things. And so you have to understand that you're dealing with a lot of people. And organizational behavior helps you understand what makes people tick on an individual level, on a group level, on a corporate level. It really helps you get into that side of understanding the organization. I think we have a good ecclesiology, right? And you've probably been studying that in this class. Now we're going to shift to understand sort of the social nature, the social dimension of the church, and how we can better lead it by understanding how people work in the context of an organization. And so we know that spiritual passion, as wonderful and important as it is, it doesn't fix bad systems or unclear roles or toxic cultures or unresolved conflicts. So OB can help you become a better steward of the resources the Lord has entrusted you. And again, it's not a silver bullet, but I think a lot of the things you're going to understand in this study here in this book are going to help you. They're going to give you like a lot of aha moments. Like, man, I really wish I understood that like 10 years ago when I was going through this issue. I've kind of come up with a model here, a 5-level model, which I think helps you scaffold all of the topics of organizational behavior. So if you understand these areas here, you'll sort of get an idea of how we can think about the field of OB, and moreover, how we can think about our organizations. So these levels are the individual level, the interpersonal level, the group level, the organizational level, and the interorganizational level. Now, on the first level is the individual level. Now, this has to do with things like personality, background, emotions, motivation, calling, etc. And I'm going to break these all down further in the book and in this video here, but I'm just kind of giving you an overview of the topics within that level. The next level is the interpersonal level. Now, we know that a lot of work in organizations has to do with our relationship with other people, right? We have one-on-one meetings, we have relationships, we have good relationships, we have not so good relationships, right? So a lot of our time really is dealing with these interpersonal relationships. And the next level is the group level. And this is where things get a little more complex as leaders, right? It's, understanding individuals, interpersonal things, but now groups, you've got a group of people, a group of individuals with their different personalities and things like that, and you're trying to get them to work together and to be a cohesive unit. In this area, we talk about things like teams, the difference between teams and groups, norms, developing norms, decision-making, conflict patterns, etc. And the next level is the organizational level. And as you can see from this diagram here, that an organization really is, when you think about it, a cluster of groups. So even within a church context, right, you have maybe your executive group or your board, but then you also have your children's ministry and your youth ministry and maybe your outreach people or maybe your operations or your production, live production, I think they call it these days, right? So the people that are kind of doing some of the behind the scenes thing and making sure the services run smoothly. Now at this level, this becomes more complex because it's not just a group of people, 8, 10 people, but now you're dealing. And here's a big challenge of organizational leadership, right, is getting these groups to function together well and to communicate well and to get along well. And how do you prioritize resources, right? So how do we figure out who gets what, who gets the the attention, the resources, the focus, those sorts of things. And at this level, so you're thinking about leadership structures, authority systems, and moreover, you're thinking about culture, right? So when you talk about organizational culture, this is kind of the level that you're looking at. You're looking at sort of the big picture. And as a leader, and we'll get more into this in part 2 of this video series, as a leader, your really purview is to think about the whole system, and not so much like, the individual things, right? So at the leader, you should be focusing on the health and well-being of the organization and the culture that you're developing as an organization. And then the next level is what's called the inter-organizational level. Now, your church, your organization doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within a ecosystem of other similar organizations. So you might be part of a denomination. You're certainly part of a community, right? So you have businesses and you have a government and you have all these other things that you are somehow related to. And it's interesting because these things all influence each other. We try to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, right? We kind of learn what it looks like to be successful. We emulate our peers, or we stand out from our peers, right? We do things differently. We have a unique mission. So there's kind of this tension and interesting interrelationship between us and the organizations around us. All right, so this is a good model to help you sort of see the big picture, the 30,000-foot view of what organizational behavior tries to look at. Now, let me break down some of these things here. And now I'm going to kind of move into some more of the details of the various chapters of the book. So in chapter 2, you can see that we look at things like personality, calling, spiritual gifts. Now, these are important because again, that individual level, an organization is comprised of a bunch of people. And sometimes as a leader, we see like clusters and groups of people, right? But on another level, another frame, you see that there are individual people. And we know that personality is important. We all have different personalities. And maybe you're aware of some of the different personality tests, Myers-Briggs personality, right? Or the Enneagram, that's become so popular now. These are ways to understand personality and what makes people tick. And as you begin to explore personality on an organizational level, you realize that a lot of your issues come because of the different personalities that you have involved. So you've probably been in a meeting where, you present an idea and one person's all excited about it and the other person's a little more thoughtful and maybe not so sure, right? Because some people are more open to risk and they like change and they like new ideas. And some people are a little more like concrete and conceptual and they want to get their facts together before they rush into the next thing, right? So right away, you've kind of got the makings of the conflict dynamic that you can see taking place is because the different personalities involved. And either is not right or wrong. You need them all, right? We need these different kinds of personalities in our churches. But understanding personality helps us understand some of the challenges. And moreover, how we can get the best out of people by putting them in roles that is conducive with their personality, right? So these extroverts, you want to have them out with your people. The introverts, they're typically going to be more comfortable dealing with ideas and processes and whatnot. We also talk about motivation in this chapter as well. Now, this is a deep subject. This is kind of an interesting one. It's got some theological, concerns. Who motivates? Is it us? Is it the Holy Spirit? How does the Holy Spirit use us to motivate people, right? So there's some interesting theological issues. But at the end of the day, people need motivation. And so part of OB helps us understand what motivates people. And it helps us understand what demotivates people, right? You can be doing things unintentionally that demotivate people. We'll talk about equity theory and what that's all about. And then spiritual gifts, right? So this is something we know about in the church. And again, from an OB textbook from a Christian perspective, I have to talk about this because we know that spiritual gifts are important individual factors that are going to contribute to the overall success and health of the church. So understanding those, so I don't do a deep dive on them, but you have to understand that's part of this mix of individual differences that you want to be aware of and make sure that people are operating within those gifts. We also talk about emotions in chapter 3. Now, some people think of organizations sort of these rational, kind of mechanical things, and people show up and you hand them a job description and they're going to do that. Well, if you've been around more than 5 minutes, you realize that's not true. People don't leave their emotions at the door when they come to work. And I've experienced it in a church context because we are more relational, emotive, experiential, that sometimes emotions are more at the forefront and we allow for those sorts of things. How many meetings have you been in where something comes up and somebody will start to tear up or Well, what's going on there? Well, you don't shut that down, right? It's like that's part of who we are. God has made us as emotional beings. So understanding how emotions work, function in a work context is an important leadership skill. And then motivation. All right, I kind of jumped ahead. I already mentioned motivation. Now, the next chapter, I believe this is chapter 5, deals with the interpersonal level. And we talk about 4 main things here. We talk about trust, friendships, psychological safety, and family systems theory. Now, all of these things are important, and you could argue that maybe these happen on larger levels too, right? Trust is a organizational issue or a group issue, so psychological safety. You could, but I wanted to camp them somewhere, so I kind of clustered these ideas. And there's other things, obviously, you could talk about in terms of the interpersonal nature, but I think these are a few ways to kind of get you thinking a little more comprehensively about the nature of some of these interpersonal relationships. So, for example, work friendships. Now, we love to have friends at work, right? We love to hang out with people, go have lunch with people. We always tend to find, at least I tend to find somebody, a couple people maybe I click with in any job, and that becomes my new work friend, right? So over the years, I've had different work friends, and this is important. This is an important function for the health of people, right? There's some good research on this one that shows that people that have good work friendships thrive more. And people that don't tend to feel isolated, as you can imagine, and may not persist or stick around or be as productive, right? So what can we do to sort of develop healthy climates for healthy friendships in an organizational context? Psychological safety, this has kind of got a lot of traction these days. Through the work of Amy Edmondson and others, this idea that organizations should be safe places for people to share of themselves, of their ideas. We know about workplace bullying, right? Bullying has kind of become an issue in a lot of contexts, but you want to create healthy organizations where people are free, not just from bullying, but free to express themselves as appropriate. Now, that doesn't mean that chaos reigns and everybody shares everything they want all the time, but as appropriate, there needs to be the climate where people feel free and safe to share of themselves. And the way I look at it is you hire people and you recruit people, volunteers, because they bring something to the table. And so to give them the freedom to express their concerns, their thoughts, their ideas is important if you really want to get all of their if you really want to get them functioning and engaged and highly productive in the mission of the church. All right, so look forward to that chapter. Now, the next level here is that group level. Now, one of the things I talk about right away in this chapter is the difference between groups and teams, right? Teams are groups, but they're more highly developed. They are more mature. They are more autonomous. They rely upon distinct skill sets to complement one another. And teams is kind of a metaphor, right, from the sports world and other dimensions, but it's kind of taken hold in the organizational world. And so how do we develop high functioning teams, right? What's the difference between a group and a team? Am I calling everybody a team, but they're really a group, right? It's going to help you understand that. How do we establish norms and roles in groups? How do we make decisions on a group level, right? So now with a group, it's not just you making a decision or a couple people making a decision, but now you've got maybe 3 or 4, 8 people, right? So how do we develop the norms for decision-making processes? We talk about that in that chapter. Some of the unspoken rules, right? Norms. A lot of things that happen are not really written down or formal. They just sort of have developed as part of the culture. So we talk about some of those kind of dynamics. And then, of course, conflict patterns as well, right? How do we deal with conflict? And sometimes I think in an organization, especially Christian organizations, we think conflict is like some stranger. It shouldn't be there. But the reality is, conflict is a pretty normal thing. And I think part of the challenge for churches, where we strive so much for unity and harmony and peace and getting along and all those kinds of things, which are important. We all want that, right? We can suppress, suppress conflict that actually can be beneficial, right? So conflict, in essence, is the expression of people with different perspectives, motives, aspirations, personalities, those sorts of things, right? And those aren't bad things. You can't suppress people from having an aspiration or a motive, because you want them, again, as I mentioned earlier, you want people to bring them best selves. And so if nobody's sharing, that doesn't necessarily mean there's peace in the organization. It means maybe there's a lack of psychological safety or a lack of trust, or they're apathetic, they just don't care, right? So an absence of conflict isn't necessarily a good thing. So how do we deal with conflict in a healthy and productive way? Well, read the chapter and find out. Now, the next level is the organizational level. And chapters 8, 9, and 10 will get into these things, and I'm going to do a whole separate video on that. But this is where you get into some of the theories of leadership, and I have 2 chapters on leadership theory, some of the more foundational theories, and then some of the newer emerging theories. As I mentioned, leadership's been studied for quite a while now. It kind of really took off in the late 70s and 80s, this whole development of leadership theory. Prior to that, it was sort of lumped together with management, right? Leadership was something a manager did. Well, it's kind of become its own thing now, right? And that's still true. We'll talk about the difference between leadership and management in those chapters. But the function and the essence and how, to think about leadership, that's all developed within the last 50 years or so. We've got a lot of interesting ideas, important ideas for you to dive into there. And then the last chapter is on culture. And we like this one in the church, right? We like to talk about culture. Well, we'll do a deep dive on that one. We'll look at some different models of culture, different types of cultures, how we can think about culture a little more systemically. And then the interorganizational level, and I sort of talked about this earlier, and this is a real interesting one too. And to be honest, to be upfront, I don't talk about this a whole lot in the book, all right? I probably need to write another book, add another chapter, but this is a fascinating approach to thinking about your organization. So when we think about things like denominations, right? A denomination is like, how do I get along with the other organizations? How do I get along with headquarters, so to speak? Or if you're in a larger church, like a multi-site church, and I've seen this one play out here, is that, where are decisions made, right? So it really speaks to the sort of centralized versus decentralized authority within a denomination. It's also networks. This has become kind of a hot topic in churches now. So, some people argue networks are the new denominations. Well, we're not going to get into that, but there's a lot of networking that takes place. Maybe you're part of a pastor's group or a church network within your own community. And there's a lot of different pressures, like I talked about earlier, sort of this idea to conform with the norms, right? So how does my church get legitimacy? And we try to gain legitimacy by conforming with some of the ideas that are prevalent within our movement, our denomination, right? So for example, let's talk about worship, right? How many of you still have an organ in your church, right? Anybody? Well, maybe you do, but a lot of you probably have synthesizers and guitars and drums and all those kinds of things. That's because that's the trend, right? And you kind of look around and say, wow, well, if I want to be the big church down the street, I better have good music and contemporary music and, have all the bells and whistles and the LED screens and all that kind of stuff, right? So this is kind of thinking about the institutional level and pressures upon an organization that cause us to be the way we are and that influence us. And then, of course, developing partnerships with other organizations. It's a real whole fascinating world there. All right, so that was our big picture overview of the topic of organizational behavior, the topics within organizational behavior. Excuse me, I gave you a model here to see how those things all fit together, how they get a little more complex as you move on up. Now, let's kind of shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about a couple other ideas. The first one is this idea of metaphors. Now, I actually talk about this in chapter 1 of the book, but this is important. Metaphors. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a way of seeing things. Gareth Morgan wrote a classic book, which I encourage you to check out. It's called Images of Organizations. And he's really laid out this idea that a metaphor is a way of seeing things, and it's also a way of not seeing things, right? So, for example, we have these different metaphors like a machine or an organism or a brain or a culture, right? So we talk about culture. Culture isn't a real thing. Culture is a perspective on what an organization is. The same thing with an organism. Now, I know we like this one. We say, well, the church is an organism. It's an organism. It's not an organization. It's an organism. Well, that is a perspective. That is a metaphor. It's not really an organism. An organism is like a biological term, right? We're not that. We're a complex thing, And so we have to, Morgan talks about the need to sort of complexify our thinking and using these different frames and reframing and using the lenses because they help us to see things from a different perspective. Now, culture is an important perspective, but also a machine is also an important perspective and metaphor too. What's a machine? Well, a machine metaphor And believe it or not, that's the most common one that people think of when they think of an organization, is they think of an organization as a machine, right? So this is sort of that structural approach. Well, we have an organizational chart, and we have policies, and we have processes. And if something's broke, we fix it, right? And if something leaves, we replace it. So we kind of use this mechanistic thinking all the time, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, right? Those are all truisms. But sometimes we overlook the nature of, for example, the culture, right? And the culture talks about the history and the values and the meaning of the organization. Or we can talk about an organism, that the organization is growing and it's changing and it's interacting with its environment in the same way that an organization does. So this idea of systems thinking, things come in, things go out. Organizations die. We don't like to talk about that one in the church, right? But sometimes, hey, let's face it, some of these churches, they're getting a little long in the tooth, as they say in Great Britain. And denominational leaders kind of have to wrestle with that. It's like, is this thing dead? Can I resuscitate it? Right? That's an organizational, organism type of approach to thinking about the organization. But Gareth Morgan gets into the other things like a brain, right? What is a brain? Well, a brain is a thinking system. It's self-referent. It is learning. And think about, how is your church or organization, how is it learning? How is it growing? How does it think about itself? What kind of plasticity does it have, right? That's kind of from the neurosciences now. We know that brains are able to adopt and they're able to change. It's really fascinating stuff. So we can take some of these metaphors and apply it to the organization to help us think about it a little bit different and a little more complex. And moreover, Morgan would say this, not to get so locked into one metaphor that we're not able to see the other ones. So you may all be all about culture, and it's all about values and our story and our DNA and those sorts of things. But you overlook some of these things like the learning aspect, or you overlook like the structure, right? And the machine, like maybe we do need a little more structure around here, right? We can't be so into tune with values and such that we don't really think about like order and process and structure and those sorts of things, all right? So all of these things are helpful and complexify our thinking about what an organization is. Now, I mentioned this in my intro, but sometimes we can over-spiritualize these things in a church, right? So not every problem is a spiritual problem. Now, we have lots of spiritual problems, and the devil is real, right? And leaders can understand things from a more human and social issue as well. So some problems are structural and human. So again, the challenge here is, how can we think a little more broadly about an organization and bring some of these other things to bear as part of our thinking, our tool set as spiritual leaders, as spirit-led leaders? What can we bring to the table here that helps us to really grow and thrive? And, what can happen if we don't understand these things? Well, I think we've had a lot of examples in the contemporary church of organizations that didn't really understand the nature of human nature, not just fallen nature, but how people work together. And when we get to our group chapter, for example, we'll talk about groupthink. And groupthink is this idea that, everybody's afraid to speak up. They don't want to challenge one another. They kind of just go along and get along. Well, that leads to a lot of problems in churches. And so understanding some of these dynamics and how people work together and how they influence each other really can bring long-term health and help us from going off the cliff as an organization, and bring shame really to the gospel and pain to a lot of people. So think about OB as a way to sort of protect yourself and to think more broadly about what's going on in a social thing. Because at the end of the day, when you think about it, churches don't fail because of like bad theology, right? Now, maybe they do. If they're a cult, they'll go off the deep end. But they usually fail because there's a human problem going on, tied to leadership and the way groups function and think, and kind of the bad culture that they've developed. So in conclusion, church is a spiritual and a social entity, and OB can help us fill in the gaps of understanding of the human social sides. Faith and prayer can't replace mishandling people issues, right? So we're people of prayer and faith, and we also know how to handle people well. And so I encourage you, become a student of the people dynamics of your church or organization. And hopefully this introduction will help you do this, and this book will help you do this. All right, so what's coming up here? In the next video, we're going to talk about leadership theory and culture. I just talked about that briefly, but chapters 8, 9, and 10, we'll get into those more in depth. because leadership is considered the crown jewel of organizational behavior, right? It's kind of brings it all together, and it's really become a focus of a lot of organizational behavior over the last few decades here. So hang on for that. I'm looking forward to exploring those chapters with you. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you. We'll see you in the next video.